Welcome to the Megablast podcast. I'm your host, Jason Mcdonald. My goal is to get to the truth through conversation. The Megablast podcast is produced by Arts and Opinion, an online journal housed at the Archives of Canada. Visit us at artsandopinion.com. I hope you enjoy today's guest. Welcome, Kristian Gravener. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. What about yourself?
Not bad, not bad. So, welcome back. This is the third time you hold the record.
I feel honored. I'm very, very, very touched.
Yeah, no, so. There's a couple things I want to mention before we get into it. You have the most visits on the Megablast podcast, followed by Martin Deck, who I recently did a second podcast with.
All my life, I've been fighting that Martin Deck. I've always wanted to defeat him. This is a big triumph for me.
Well, you're going to have to keep at it because he's coming back. We did a podcast the other day about Tintin. Are you a fan of Tintin?
I was as a child.
Okay, so that's up if you want to listen to it. And anybody listening, I'm partly doing a plug here. And he's going to come back because we did it in two parts. We're looking at the sort of germination, the sort of rise of fascism in Europe as how it connects, and then we're going to do the later post-World War II. So you're in competition with Martin Deck of Windsor, Ontario.
I did my master's degree on the rise of fascism in Europe, by the way. So I'm going to listen to Martin and whatever his name is, and he's going to hear from me afterwards.
All right, look forward to it. So it's funny because there's a sort of an idea that I told you about, that we would do this on a sort of a regular basis, right? So the idea would be to talk about Montreal, Quebec, Canada, because those things are we are those things.
Sure.
So this is the first of that.
Yes,
good. Put it that way, right? I don't know if it's Abbott and Costello. Or I don't know who's who.
Yeah.
Am I the fat one? So I'm Costello.
You're the one with the good voice.
Right. But a better comparison. You know Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter?
No.
The black guys at Blogging Heads. They're Glenn Lowry's an economist. John McWhorter's a linguist, and they've been doing these bi-weekly conversations for over 10 years.
Oh. And
Glenn Lowry's very interesting. He was a sort of very conservative with the Reagan Revolution and it being black. That was a kind of a hip thing in those days. And then he had a downfall in a crack scandal at one point. Yeah, it's an amazing story. Wow. And then he kind of got out of that. But he's a brilliant thinker, incredibly amazing, articulate, and an economist too. I love the way economists think. We talked about this on the last podcast. So that's a nicer comparison. Okay. Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. But to begin, we want to devote this episode to the election. So I thought maybe we could you put up a video on TikTok about an arrest of a man in the Laurentians for putting up it looks like a tweet.
Yes, an incredible story. Somebody wrote me on Facebook saying, "Oh, you should look into this." And there was a story up, I believe, on CTV Montreal or one of those sites. Basically, a very bare bones story article about a guy, a provincial MNA, a member of the CAQ party, the Quebec City region. I can't remember his name, but he objected because he saw his likeness on Twitter with some blood dripping down from the top. So what was interesting was that the person who posted this presumably objected to the fact that he, as a CAQ member, rejected the call for an inquiry into the many deaths in the old age homes, which is a big deal for a lot of people in Quebec. People want a public investigation into this whole thing. Why did so many people die at the COVID thing at the start? The West Island Heron Dorval home and all that stuff, and many other places. So a lot of people have a burr in their bonnet about this particular thing, so they're not happy. So this is why this guy, whoever it was, posted this image of the guy with, fake blood coming down, which to me, it would simply imply that he's got blood in his hands. So the candidate, who's already a sitting member of...
is it Sylvain Gagnon? Is that the guy's name? Is that right?
Yeah,
The
it
name
could. I
is
believe
just
it's
that's
Sylvain
the
something.
Sylvain. Yeah, that's
So
the candidate's name from the Quebec City region.
he's a
Yeah.
fairly innocuous, not sort of a roly-poly guy. You never really notice a fairly innocuous character. So he's got this seat, which is actually a swing ride and goes back and forth various parties. So who knows? Maybe feeling a bit insecure, although obviously he shouldn't because the CAQ has a massive lead in this election. So there had been a couple of cases in the past of uh, candidates and politicians in Quebec saying that they were threatened by people, and this seems to be a great strategy to get sympathy. Like if you do something egregiously wrong, I believe, for example, Nazem Kadri, the hockey player, he freaking almost decapitated somebody in a game during the playoffs, and instead of everybody being mad at him, he said, "Oh, somebody wrote a mean tweet about me," and suddenly Nazem Kadri is the victim, whereas he, of course, was the perpetrator. So it's pulling the victim card on internet abuse is a real winning thing. This candidate out of the blue actually phoned the provincial police and said, "Hey, I'm a victim of a threat." I guess he thought it was
Hate crime or
a
death
death threat
threat?
or
Is
something
that
like that,
yeah, right.
and then it was entirely incoherent what happened next, which is the government arrested him, the police arrested him, and prosecutors brought him in. And according to the article I read, once again, I didn't do any further research. I just reported what I saw others reporting, and nobody else seemed to think it was a big deal, but I do.
I
They
do too. Just that's why I'm putting it out here.
they
Yeah.
they they brought him in. I guess they put him in a jail cell, and they told him, "We're going to decide what we're going to charge you in a
Yeah.
few weeks." Which to me, I don't really understand. I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, that to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. You got to know, isn't it part of habeas corpus or something that they're charging you with what? Like, what's the deal? So it seems to me, even if they don't even end up charging him, they're kind of like putting the fear of God into people for criticizing their MNAs or elected representatives. Who I think it should be
It should be known
and it should
that
be
this happened.
underlined the fact that
Yeah.
these MNAs did absolutely zero. All
Yeah.
we were ruled by decree for 2 freaking years, which is Francois Legault and a couple of people
Yeah.
were deciding everything in our lives, including like drastic measures like the curfew.
Curfew.
Oh my
Yeah.
God! Don't get me started on the curfew. So what we had is a situation where it was basically a dictatorship, and we were
Unopposed by the opposition parties, which is so
unbelievable,
strange.
unbelievable.
Every 10 days, Francois Legault reaffirmed, whatever, just
Yeah.
redid the
Yeah,
emergency
he
status
renewed, I
or
think, once
renewed.
every
Yeah,
week for 200 straight weeks or
yeah.
even more. I'm not even sure.
It's astonishing. I
It's
mean,
just
the
crazy.
first period. I mean, to try not to be too partisan about this. I think reasonable people could understand in 2020, at least for a certain amount of time during 2020, why that might have had to happen. We got into 2021; it was still going on. You and I got together for a meeting with some friends in June, and I was informed there we were downtown by Kristian who
Sure.
ran for the PPC, that the state of emergency was still ongoing. And I'm not sure. Maybe it
Yeah.
is now. I don't know. Like I thought that's just insane. But just to return to this case,
Yeah.
because this case is really interesting. So we don't know what the man has been charged with. That seems to
It's
be right.
presumably like a death
Sort of
threat
a death
thing.
threat,
What? Because
some
they can't
sort. Right.
really. But once
Okay.
again, I don't even know. It's probably around in a couple of days they were going to decide that, or he's got to
Okay.
appear in court. Will they even charge him? I don't know. Or
Is
and
he? He was put into a cell for a
I
period of
don't know.
time.
They
We
didn't
don't know.
identify him. He was
Yeah.
from a town about 90 minutes north of Montreal. And the other weird thing about this, the other strange element was that the Sûreté de Quebec provincial police, he was quoted as saying it's against the law to deface a political sign,
Mhm.
which I mean this is a case of somebody going
It's
on.
a meme. It's a meme.
It's a
It's
me.
not a sign. That was the thing on your video. It's like they couldn't deface the sign. It was someone had taken Photoshop to a picture of a sign and spread it
So
around,
to me, that's
which is very
absolutely
weird.
incoherent. Like if
Yeah.
I was a journalist and somebody told me that on the phone, I'm like, what are you even talking about? But as you know, the journalists who wrote this story, I believe CTV, they just wrote it down, and I guess they had some other task to do. They
Cut and
didn't like.
paste. Yeah.
I don't get this. It doesn't make sense to me. So I mean,
Yeah.
as a reader, as a writer, like I
You're a
actually
writer. Yeah, you are a
and
writer.
in
Yeah.
fact, I actually wrote for CTV
Yeah.
Montreal site for many years, for 5, 7 years or something like that. And so I know exactly how those things work. And it's like, I don't want to be blown tooting my own horn here, but of course, if I was
Well,
on the
you are an
phone,
experienced journalist and
if I'm
writer.
on the
Yeah,
phone, I'd be like, "What are you talking about? Why are you saying that the sign was defaced? Where's the sign?" Anyway,
right.
they just wrote it down and moved on to their next thing, and it's like that.
So part of it sounds like you're from what you're telling me now. That's different from what I understood from the TikTok video. Is that part of the problem is the media not doing a good enough job
But that, I mean, that's
in
just
some
standard.
senses,
I
which
mean,
has
that's
become standard at
it's
this
just so
point, right?
it's to be expected at this
Yeah,
point.
because
It's
that's mysterious. If they said a sign was defaced,
okay, so
there's
I
no
mean, the
sign. So
media landscape.
that's
I mean, I don't
yeah.
have to go down this whole rabbit hole, but obviously, the fact is, there's no money in journalism anymore. So it's like they got to chase whatever they can. The government's going to give them a few nickels and dimes. That's fine. And of course, as a journalist yourself, you're doing it very half-heartedly. Like, what can I find a better career? It's like this is just a short-term thing. Whereas back, when I was doing it, it was a noble profession. It was something that you're
Mm,
so proud
mm.
to do. See your name on the article, and it was like people reading it. So nowadays, it's the whole thing is
Yeah.
shambolic. It's falling apart.
Just to stick a little bit on the journalism, don't you think there's still a kind of a nobility just to searching for the truth? I mean, that's the
Yeah,
byline of
sure,
this podcast is to get to the truth.
absolutely.
So, like, I think we should not just because many journalists that seems to be a second order concern for many journalists, for what you're saying,
Okay,
right? Or is it if like I'm trying to understand why they're not doing that? It could be they're rushing to the next story. It could be they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know how to do
excellent
journalism.
question.
Like I don't know. From what you're saying, it
Right.
sounds obscure to me. It could
Okay,
be.
that's
Yeah.
something I've wondered about as well. When I was at
Yeah.
CTV, we were in a situation where it was wild, wild west. It was fairly new. Uh, we were just throwing up any articles, and the people, they would trust us. And if it was there was a mistake, you'd kind of just go back and edit it, right? I worked for CTV for a while, and I'm sorry, CBC for a while after CTV, but it was a little bit more guarded. People would be vetting your story, and it was less fun to do it like that because it was just too much bureaucracy. And what I'm seeing, of course, is you're asking how does the management sort of direct the narrative? That is the question, right? So
Mhm.
you would
Yeah.
have like an exec, what do you call it, a meeting, right? All the people would sit around the table at CTV. It was when it was Barry Wilson and the reporters, whoever was there at the time, and I would sit there too, whoever
Was this a
was.
regular event, like
It
once
would
a
be,
week,
yeah,
once a
about
day?
11 a.m. every day, and they would
Right.
decide
Okay.
what stories they were going to do and that sort of thing. And of course,
It sounds like in the movies, like Johnson, get out there,
yeah,
get down to the train station to see. Is it sort of like that?
these movies, when you see a movie with journalists, they're always fake because these newspapers have like 100 people in them. A real newspaper place or a real media place only has a couple of,
10.
yeah,
Yeah.
just a
Right.
handful of
Right. Okay.
people. So
Anyway, so it's not quite like in the movies, but anyway, so they sit down there at 11 a.m. and they basically look at what's coming down the news wire that
yeah,
day.
and if somebody has an insight, like they say, "Oh, this guy's a fraud. Don't trust what he says," or whatever, that kind of thing. You could chirp that in, but mostly people are trying to be like, they're not.
You
I'm
don't
not.
want to disturb the
I'll
right.
shoot my mouth off, no problem. But
Yeah.
other people,
Yeah.
they're
You're not a
very
spoken guy.
polite and stuff, and just sort of like won't say anything at the meeting, and the boss will say this is what's happening. So
Mm,
that to me is not a very good direct way to control the message. So I don't know exactly. I'll give you another example. Just
yeah.
recently, I was called up at the CBC to be an analyst for a story, right? So they were going to call me, and I was going to answer questions about this Quebec story. Somebody from Winnipeg and Halifax and St. John's, New Brunswick. So or St. John's, Newfoundland, was going to call me and I was going to talk about this Quebec story. It was all very last minute. And I happened to know a little bit about it. So they gave me, what, $300 to do a 4 or 5 interviews. So the thing was, the way that it worked, the intermediary, I believe, was some sort of freelancer, said, what are your answers going to be to these questions I've written? So I told her, and I guess they were acceptable. And I could say whatever
And
I
then
wanted,
change.
but it was kind of going to be based on what I wrote. So it was like
Right.
sort of approved. You know what I mean? It was a government approved answer that I gave. So I did say what I wanted, but she could have said, you know what? I don't think you're right for this, right? So that's sort of like an interesting way that it kind of like
Can be controlled.
it is. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that was it.
Shaped.
Yeah. It was.
That's really what you're touching. You touched on a couple of things that are interesting. One is the shaping of the narrative. It's kind of like on the Jimmy Fallon and stuff. They do
Mhm.
pre-interviews. They kind of it's the
Yeah.
same. It sounds like that's entertainment, but the
Sure.
idea is the same. Like we're talking about this and that, so it's very staged. The other thing that you mentioned, this editing after something was up, I've heard Matt Taibbi talk about this as a kind of Orwellian thing. A news story goes up, it's got some, whatever, it goes up, people are reading it, and then it turns out some really important fact is wrong, so they just go in and change it.
And I don't
Yeah,
think
and
that's,
I
yeah,
think, and
yeah,
he
sure.
points out there's sort of an Orwellian, like,
Yeah.
is there, should we have some discussion right now in our society to have some sort of code of ethics for that? Like
Hmm.
a good organization should say, we publish at this time every day, kind of like the old newspapers. You could just go find an older copy of it, and they would publish, not retractions,
Yeah.
but they would say editors note, a
Yeah.
previous version of this story.
Yes.
Sometimes they do that.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, is there? It sounds like you're saying this Wild West was before this discussion started, and people were just doing that. Are people making these, like, openly saying, "We made this change. We apologize for the previous one that was
Well,
wrong"?
okay.
Or
I think you have to understand that it's like there's premium on being fast, right? You want to be the
yeah,
first to get that story up. So it's like it doesn't necessarily have to be a masterpiece, but just get it up fast. So at CTV, what would happen is somebody, I don't know, like what was that actor who died of heroin in New York? The blonde guy, I can't remember his name, but he was like a big
Philip
deal for a while.
something, Philip
Yeah,
the big
Seymour.
Seymour Hoffman.
Anyway,
Yeah,
so
yeah, I remember that.
so the guys, the boss of our office says, "Hey, that guy died. Write something up, but write it up. Don't put it as a CP news story. Put it as our story, and just keep updating it." So he wanted to get a lot of clicks on this story, and it was
Right.
wasn't a bad idea. Let's get clicks on this freaking Philip Seymour Hoffman's pretend it's like our story. So I was just like wrote it 3 sentences. Philip Seymour Hoffman is it. Circumcised so bang, it's up. We put a little photo up there, the
People
headline,
start clicking on it.
and
That's
so people
it's
start clicking
trending.
on it.
Yeah,
And so
right.
it's like then add more, add more, add more, add more. So it was like we were just adding to it all
Mhm.
day long, and we did this.
So nothing changed. You just added to it.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
did. You did. Like, you weren't. Matt Taibbi is talking about when sort of a longer story is put up, and then the next day somebody realizes some important fact is wrong or
But
something, and then they just
yeah,
change it. They just update it, and it's like,
okay.
oh, disappeared.
I have no
Yeah.
objections to that. I don't really understand what the okay. So
Don't you think that's a little bit Orwellian
well,
though?
I
That it's
was
sort of done
okay.
without any note. Like, it's just, this is just my view of that. Is
I've got a
yeah.
bias. Like I was back in the day of print media, we would put out these articles in the Montreal Mirror, and they were like printed in stone. Once they were out in the street, there was
And
obviously,
it's a week till the next one comes out,
yeah, it
right?
was
Yeah.
like, and so if you made a mistake, it was kind of like fairly disastrous and embarrassing, right? But
Right. Yeah.
when now you write, I've been writing stories on my site Coolopolis for what years and years, 20 years, 15 years,
Great site, by the way,
and
for anyone listening. Yeah.
and so people will say, "Oh, my friend didn't like what you wrote about him or her or something." And could you take it down or change it? I'm like, no, I'm from the old school where it's out there, it's on the paper, it's there. And
Good for you.
my standard answer is, of course, look, the Gazette wrote about this, La Presse wrote about this. If they take it down, I'll take it down. You get them to take it down, and then maybe I'll take it down. We'll see.
Okay. So, but you're actually arguing in favor of what I'm saying, because if you just leave something up and don't change it and then put something up, but I think Taibbi is saying they will edit something that's like there'll be a story going around on
Yeah,
USA Today or New
right.
York Times or something, and it'll be going around, and then the next day when they realize there's a mistake, they'll just edit it without
Oh, I see.
telling
Okay.
anybody,
Yeah, I get
so
you.
that
Yeah,
so that it's kind of like you're reading it, and it makes it hard. Sometimes you may have had this experience.
yeah,
You'll be having you'll read something, oh my god, that, and then you'll go and try and find it again, and you can't. Have you ever had that? And you think,
yeah.
what, it sort
I
of
see. Yeah,
disappeared, or at least it's a different thing that you remember, and you
yeah,
think, am I crazy?
yeah.
So this is, I
Well,
think it's adding to this sense of confusion about what's
sure.
real. And should there,
Yeah,
my question is
yeah,
kind of like your ethics. You say, I'm not taking it down. I'm leaving it. It's a mistake. Even if
yeah.
it's a mistake, should there be some sort of code of ethics there? I don't know how that
Well,
would
look,
even
my
work
feeling is
out.
that no, I will change stuff if it's obviously wrong. I have so many damn typos in my story. I'm changing shit all the time.
Typo. I'm not talking about typos,
Well, I
but
mean, even yeah,
Matt
sure.
Taibbi pointed this out. He said
Okay,
he said not typos, but like
okay.
important facts. Sorry to
Okay,
interrupt.
but
Yeah,
my point is, if it's that egregious, if somebody wrote something that incorrect, I mean, you could screenshot it, and
that's true.
you
Yeah,
can
it's a good
show the
point.
world somebody said
Yeah.
something really
It's a
crazy.
good point. Yeah. It never really, deleting it or changing it never really takes it away in the world today, right? Is your point, right?
And yeah, and
Yeah.
in a way, you could you're infamy will last an eternity. Like, for example, to take, who was it, van der Leyden in Germany? She was on stage saying, I don't care what the German people think. I'm going to keep on supporting this thing in Ukraine regardless. So that became like a meme. Like, how could anybody say something that insane? Like, I'm a
I
German
don't.
politician. I don't care about the
I don't care
Germans.
what the population
What is she
thinks.
talking
Yeah.
about? So it's like, I mean, you could say,
Yeah.
that can't be changed. It's people have seen it.
Yeah, yeah, that's sort of a discussion about like gaffes.
Yeah.
Like when a politician makes a gaffe, if they can walk it back. Okay, so just to return to the election, that's a really chilling story. This particular thing about this guy in Laurentians, and
Yeah, well,
it's
they like to put
really
it into the basket of other sort of threats to politicians stories, which I don't think it falls into that basket. But if you accept that it's in that basket, then it's not that alarming. But I do personally think it doesn't really fall
mm,
into that category.
it would be really good if someone could try and like a good journalist could go and try and talk to the police if they've entered. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
someone, I mean, I don't know, aren't there experts on terrorism and stuff who could try and figure out, is this guy insane? Is he really going to go and
Yeah.
do, just to be clear, I think what the person is trying to say, to get back to clarify for the audience, is this, this politician, Sylvain Gagnon, I think is his name, voted in favor. He was one of the entire National Assembly who voted against opening up an inquiry as to what happened in 2020.
Yeah, and
Right?
not only that, but
Yeah,
people were upset by the fact that they actually cheered for themselves after
that
defeating
was
the motion.
right.
That was like a freakish,
So,
weird
so
thing. It was so inappropriate.
just to explain this, because it's I'm sort of having trouble understanding it, so I want to articulate it to myself, and maybe the listeners can understand it as well. So there was this disaster in 2020. People died, and a
Mm.
lot of people died because the health system failed. We're going to get back to the health
Right.
system in just a minute, but and someone proposed, or there's some proposition to open an inquiry. So what the fuck happened? Like, what the hell happened there? The entire National Assembly voted against opening an inquiry. In other words, saying we're not going to look into what
Well, okay,
happened.
the PQ made
Right?
the motion,
The
so
PQ made
obviously
the
they
motion.
supported
Okay,
the motion, but I
good.
don't know how the Liberals voted.
Thank
But
you, because I wasn't. Yeah, I just appreciate that. So the PQ proposed this motion. The CAQ have a majority, so that
mhm,
whatever motions are proposed, they can vote down. So the PQ, good on the PQ, by the way. I mean,
I
good
agree.
for them
I agree.
for sticking up for that. So that's one thing. Good question about the Liberals, because they seem to be dropping the ball a lot these days. But anyway, the CAQ defeated it, perhaps with the help of some of the other parties. And then and they said, oh, so we defeated this motion to open an inquiry, and then they clapped for
Yeah.
themselves for doing that, which, I mean, you appear to have a lot of contempt for that, as I do, and that's a
It's entirely
odious thing.
inappropriate.
It's
It's
very
absolutely
inappropriate,
crazy that they would do that.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's contemptible. I mean, just in the context of the people who died and the real, the real concerns about the health system. I don't understand. Do they normally clap when they win? I mean, it seems odd, though. Anyway, I
I
don't know
don't know.
how. Okay, so that's the story there. And so this guy in the Laurentians puts up, is was disgusted by this unnamed man,
Mhm.
and found a internet image of this politician in question and put some blood on it,
Yeah,
and
some
then
sort of
some sort of,
generic
not blood,
template,
but
which was, it
right.
doesn't look
It
real at
doesn't look
all,
real,
and
yeah.
it wasn't like he
What
was bleeding in the picture. It was just sort of
it
blood is
was
coming
I,
down in front of him, right?
on the splash page for this episode, I'm going to put up an image of
Okay.
that. Yeah, maybe
And
they'll
that
become. Yeah, maybe they'll come
and
to my
and
house.
that's
Yeah, yeah,
okay. Listen, that's the
right.
other
Yeah,
point. I wanted to make this other point. It's like, how exactly is it that he was actually being charged with
yeah.
spreading, publishing this image, and all of the news media reprinted this image?
And
So
they weren't charged,
how could, yes,
right? Yeah,
it
right.
was no problem at all. So how is it so egregious, this image, if all of the
If the
news
news media.
media is just reprinting it left and right?
Great question. Great question. That's somewhat of a mystery you pointed out in your TikTok video, which is really, really interesting. So that's basically what happened, and that's an ongoing story, and it connects it. It brings us to the healthcare system. Just on a side note, I'm going to be interviewing the Conservative Party of Quebec health critic, I guess, Roy Epen tomorrow. So he's going to inform me of the Conservative Party's
And he's a doctor,
policies.
right?
He's a doctor. Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
So that's something. I just wonder if you, what do you think about how does the health system intersect into this election? It's a very important issue in your view.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. I'm glad you asked that because I wonder about this stuff all the time. And it's such a complex thing. The health system, like I was looking at old newspapers from a few years ago, and the Gazette ran like a 6-part series of about 3,000 word articles analyzing how are we going to, fix the budget for the healthcare. And it was really
yeah,
detailed. And it's just this conundrum. There was every part of the thing that was looked at. I didn't read the whole thing, but it shows that there was a lot of thought being put towards this issue, right? This is not something that people are taking lightly. This is obviously a long-term thing, and it's I my sense of what I was seeing in that whole series of articles was this is unmanageable. We could try this, that, and the other, and
yeah.
but it's probably nothing's going to work. So it's I'm extremely pessimistic. So my reading of what happened over the last few years, we had the Liberal parties in for almost every year over the last whatever 20 years, except for 18 months when Pauline Marois had her ill-fated government. So we've had the Liberals for a long time, and after Charest left, it was taken over by Philippe
Couillard.
Couillard, who was
Yeah, yeah.
the premier for a while. So Couillard, if you don't remember, was a brain surgeon. The guy was
Literally a
a
brain surgeon.
brain surgeon. So obviously he knew the healthcare system, and he got his guy Barrett, another guy, a doctor, who was a bit of a vulgar guy, but he's a tough guy as well, and he knows a thing or
He was
two.
the big fat guy, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, because he
yeah.
was morbidly obese and everything.
So
Yeah,
a
okay.
lot of people don't like
Yeah,
him because he had a lot of weird things going on. But
okay.
he between the two of them, they had a good nose for the fact that is healthcare is a bottomless pit of money.
Yeah,
We can no matter how much money we throw at it, still won't be
yeah.
that good. So they did a lot of rearranging and stuff, and I got to kind of like Couillard in particular was so freaking sharp. The guy is a very guy's got an IQ of about 140, I would say,
Yeah.
and he's a great administrator, knows his files. Famously, you'd go into his meetings and he would know the file. You'd be intimidated because he would already know everything about what you're saying.
More than
Because
the experts in the
yeah,
room,
it was
kind of
just
thing. Yeah,
the guy
right.
was a phenomenal character, and it's like to me it was like greatly shook my feeling of
Politicians being
well, I mean,
no,
the
yeah.
electorate in Quebec that they would choose Legault over this guy. How the heck is that a thing? I couldn't freaking believe it.
But they
Legault.
weren't choosing the individual. They were saying we're tired of the big red machine and the separatist party. That's what really was happening. But
Well, I
that's what I
mean,
think really. I don't think it was Legault himself. Is all I'm saying. I don't
yeah.
think they were looking at like Legault and Couillard. I don't mean to
Okay. No, it could be.
necessarily
It could be.
dispute
I
what you're
don't know.
saying. It's just
I honestly,
yeah,
I would like to understand this, and I don't understand it at all. But I mean, the Journal de Montréal ran this whole sort of like campaign against the Liberals, implying they were corrupt based on the Charbonneau Commission. And it's like the Charbonneau Commission was a mistake because the opposition kept on saying you need to have an inquiry into this the corruption, and Charest was saying, well, I don't think we need that. Thank you very much. The police are doing this job. So eventually he relented and allowed this expensive commission to take
and it was
place.
his downfall. The
And it was
slip.
a mistake, and
Yeah.
I don't even think much ever really came of it. If you actually
Well, they
follow,
discovered there's corruption in Quebec, which is what pretty much everybody said. I remember at the beginning, I was like, they're going to spend millions of dollars. They're going to find out that some money's being siphoned off. It's and that's pretty much what they found out.
so
Yeah,
that was a two-pronged attack. The Liberals got this reputation for being corrupt, which I don't think they deserve because what you've got is a Liberal government who's actually doing major things, like the whole REM that's going to be the train thing
yeah.
that's being built. That was their baby.
Huge,
I think it
huge
was a
public
brilliant
transport project all around the Montreal
and it
area.
was quite
Yeah,
clever the way they had a very smart
yeah.
guy who was in charge of that, and of course they did the super hospitals and they did
Champlain Bridge. Well,
they
that's
did
partly federal.
the
That's,
Turcotte rebuild. So they were
yeah.
really doing a lot of. So every one of those projects is going to involve countless contracts with people, and yeah, you're going to get things that turn to shit. So it's
Well, the real question is, are they more corrupt than whatever other opposition could be? Now, that's hard to measure because the big red machine, as you mentioned, has been dominant.
mm,
It's been the dominant party. The PQ has been when there's a timeout,
sure.
basically going back to and what so I mean it's hard to make a comparison of whether the big red machine is more corrupt than the Parti Québécois or than the CAQ now. I
Hmm.
don't know how a person could make that comparison, because otherwise it's a meaningless thing. I mean, if the CAQ are just as corrupt as the Liberals, then, what's the point of,
Well, okay, so the CAQ, I don't
right?
know if they're corrupt or not. So far, but they haven't got any projects. Whether their projects are to
They're
get
not in the
Muslims from
Montreal area.
stop them from
They
wearing hats or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
What are they even
Well,
what are they even doing?
they're continuing what the Liberals did. They haven't, which is not one thing, but they're also their projects that they want to do appear to be in the Quebec City region.
Right, right.
They want to do the tunnel under the river. They
Sure.
want to do, the tramway in Quebec City. They
That's
want
because Quebec
that.
City is like a swing riding area where
Yeah,
it goes back and
well,
forth, right?
their base is not Montreal, so they're
Yes,
ignoring Montreal,
but
right? Yeah,
the
okay,
Quebec City is
right.
volatile. It will sometimes be federalist, and other times it's very
Right,
unpredictable.
right, yeah. So it's partly political. It's also, I also think it's partly just it's like they represent, Montreal is not represented in the CAQ at all. I think what the island of Montreal, there are two seats, I
Hmm.
believe. Is that
Hmm.
right? I mean, you
Hmm.
may know
Yeah,
more,
it's very
right?
few.
It's
It's
very few.
almost none.
And they obviously culturally and stuff, they're very much, they represent the interests of French Canadian kind of center right sort of not
Yeah,
traditionalist, but just and they don't, and the Montreal area is not of concern to them. Now, I'm not defending
yes,
them. I'm just saying it to
yeah.
explain why they don't appear to be doing anything because their base is outside of Montreal, right?
Yes, I find I don't
So
understand the appeal of the CAQ one bit. So you have to look for
yeah,
elsewhere if you want to get a good explanation. But I do find him quite enigmatic. He has a reputation of being not a separatist, but of course he's a separatist. Of course he's a separatist. He was with the PQ forever, and now separatism is on the shelf because now they realize they got such a great deal with the transfer payments that of course there's no point in separating. But if that ever the plug gets pulled on that, it's going to be a lot of tears flowing. And
did you know that they put a motion at the last CAQ caucus, like recently, to have a referendum?
I didn't
This
even
this
know that.
this came
I didn't
out.
even know
I
that.
heard this. I forget where. There's someone should
Yeah.
fact check this, but it was voted down. It was like
Mm-hmm.
shot down within seconds or whatever. But the fact that it would even come up is so kind of amazing because their whole brand is kind of, yeah, maybe we'll do that in 40 or 50 years. Right now we're
Yeah.
cool with Canada. It's all good,
Yeah.
blah blah blah. But anyway,
Well,
sorry I
the
interrupted.
other thing is that he has this sort of reputation of being like the successful businessman, like some sort of Berlusconi or Trump or something. But he is not. He's like he fluked into
Air
one deal.
Transat.
Yeah, he had that one
Yeah.
deal that he happened to be involved in, and of course he sold his shares under. He did it in a very sneaky way. Got out of there and he walked away. But of course his policies are totally unfriendly to business. He doesn't care what like for example, a great example is the employers groups want like 90,000 immigrants per year, and he wants 60,000. Which I mean, I would just give them the 90,000. Why wouldn't you? Who cares? But for some reason,
That's higher than it used to be. 45,000. That was the normal number. How do you know how many actually come in? I think it's 45.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
think it's high, way
Okay.
higher than that. So even
So
60 is low. So
60 is lower.
yeah,
Okay,
they
because it
want
used to be
90,000,
45.
and he doesn't want
Interesting.
to give them
Yeah.
90,000. And of course,
Okay.
what we've got now is a manpower crisis, and people, especially outside of
Yeah.
Montreal, can't find people to hire. It's a disaster. You listen to the radio in these small towns, and they're like, please come and apply here.
Well,
We need people.
yeah, on the radio that there are, first of all, you drive around Montreal, nous embauchons everywhere. I mean,
Sure.
we are hiring is like on everything. This is not unique to Quebec, right? And outside Montreal, it's even more extreme because in Montreal you have a lot of immigrants and people who are willing
Right.
to work, so it's less. But just to get back to this idea of the appeal. I mean, I think that there's a move in many parts of the world, a kind of a hesitancy towards the open globalization, kind of like just the kind of, you see this manifested all over the place, and I think that the way it's playing out in Quebec, in the political structure that we have, is people from off island, they're that's how it's expressing itself politically, is they're looking. There's this incredible change going on in the world. The world's changing really quickly, and they're still, if you're living in a smaller town somewhere, and they've always viewed Montreal with suspicion anyway.
Sure.
Now it may feel even more foreign than it used to be. Oh yeah, you heard English everywhere. Now you hear English everywhere, and there's all these turbans or something, like it's like different. Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm trying to put on my small town, traditional French Canadian kind of,
Yeah.
slow change, relaxed, not
Yes.
very socially cohesive, and not into sort of confrontation glasses. And
Yes.
that's how the world might look. And maybe the CAQ might be reasonable from that point of view. Maybe. I mean, I don't know.
Like,
I'm not trying to convince you of that,
okay,
because I know
so
you're
we
not.
know that the Go
Yeah.
actually operates by polls, right? He spent insane amount of government money, our tax dollars, on polls. So it's like he will basically set his policy based on what people are saying in the polls. So they actually did a poll on, do you want 60,000 immigrants or 90,000 immigrants? So people overwhelmingly said, we want 60,000 immigrants. So it was like,
Interesting.
you got to understand that, like, you could go
I
into
didn't know that.
you could
That's
go
yeah.
into a bar somewhere on the plateau or something, and the guy next to you will actually know the name of the minister and the sub minister and what the sub minister said. It's like, what the hell? The English people don't know anything about that.
We
It's
don't.
crazy.
Yeah, we
If
don't
if
care
you
about it.
look at
That's true. Yeah,
the voting participation rate in Quebec, it's way higher than someplace like
it's true.
Alberta. I actually looked at this just today, and it's like Alberta is like that in the 40s and 50s from the provincial
Elections.
elections. That's how many
We
percentage of
get
people
70
we
sometimes,
got.
65,
Like in
70%.
1985, we got
Yeah.
in 1976 we got 85%. I
Yeah.
mean,
Wow.
there was one year, I think 2008, it seemed to be very low everywhere. Alberta and Quebec was very low, but otherwise we're reliably into the 70s and stuff. So you got to give, I don't think they're ignorant.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not like
They're aware of what the
oblivious.
population. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I don't understand. Like, for example, he gets very high marks in how he handled the COVID crisis, which to me is like, are you kidding me? We were freaking locked in our houses at night for 7 months.
I know. Well, that definitely seems to be a kind of a cultural difference that you just mentioned between the Anglo. We're both on the Anglo side, so I have a friend in Gatineau who he lives here, and we were talking about this the other day, and he's an American, but his wife is French Canadian, and he said, God, in this province, looking at it from the sort of libertarian, and he's an American, he's like, it feels like people here that they're just so govern me harder, daddy. Like
Yes,
it's like
yes,
they
yes,
want the
yes, yes.
government to be like,
It's incomprehensible.
yeah.
I don't understand it. I don't understand it
At
one
the
bit.
same time, there is a long history in Quebec of being very individual, like not individual, but collectively independent of the government. I mean, there's people like Maxime Bernier. Brian Mulrooney was a Quebecer from a small town. There's a long, there, and then I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. Like, that's just the mood right now of that part of the population. I'm not entirely convinced it couldn't change in the future, and I don't. And just to return to the election here, the polls are showing, and you mentioned how he's governing by polls,
Hmm.
which I think is just. I am so tired of politicians just going by polls. Trudeau is even worse
Hmm.
on this, right?
Hmm.
Just looking at polls and not having a kind of, it's kind of like a person who doesn't have a set of values and just looks at like some people in my family seem to be this way. They look at everything. They just look at it and go, okay, I think this from this. They don't look at it like, okay, what is my value? Like
Yes.
I believe in freedom of speech or this, and then apply that axiom to whatever the
Hmm.
issue is. They kind of do it the other way around.
Sure.
This is where you get these contradictions, like my body, my choice is okay
Yeah.
for abortion, but not, all of a sudden
Yeah.
with vaccines, then it goes out the window and then it goes back with abortion. It's kind of because they're not using an axiom, right?
Hmm.
If the axiom is my body, my choice, then that has to apply also to an
Yeah.
injection in your arm. It has to. I mean, it's really, but I just wanted to return to this poll thing. Right, they're showing 42%. The Conservative Party showing 9 to 19, depending on the poll.
Hmm.
Do you have a sense of, I mean, we're getting into the realm of predictions here,
Yeah.
which is dangerous, but
Yeah.
I mean, do you think there's going to be any surprises, or do you think they're just going to roll to a massive
I think
victory?
it's a
I
great
don't know.
question.
The
So,
CAQ right now are,
yeah.
just to be clear to our listeners, with 42%, where those votes are likely to be distributed,
Mhm.
if that's true, he should win a blasting, overwhelming
I mean,
majority victory, just to be
I
clear,
mean,
right?
if at the extreme they could win 100 seats, and
out of
the Liberals could
125. 100 out of 125. Is that right?
whatever it is. I don't know how many.
That would be a massive victory.
And the
Yeah.
Liberals might only win 10 seats. I think the Liberals will win a bit more than 10, but it's like if you look at both extremes of the predictions, that could be that would be an absolute disaster for democracy. And it's like we have to ask what the hell happened to the Liberal Party. It's like this is one of the things that's been preoccupying me. They have a leader named Dominique Anglade who somehow was an uncontested candidate for the leadership, which I'd like somebody, if anybody out there is listening to this, can explain to me how she became the leader of the Liberal Party uncontested. Nobody else wanted to run for the party. That doesn't make sense to me. Even the little crap parties like the Bloc Québécois, when they had no support at all, or the PQ, would have like 8 or 9 people trying to get the leadership. It doesn't make sense to me. There must have been a memo that went around saying, do not run against her because you're going to get a horse's head in your bed if you try.
That could have happened.
And so
Yeah.
so of course she's been an absolute disaster. I mean, the Liberals never got under 21 seats as far as I can recall, and now they're going to go way under that. So,
You mean in history they've never gotten?
or I'm sorry,
Is that
21%, I should say. Yeah.
21%? Yeah.
So this is
Right.
uh,
That's what they got last time. 21%, right?
I
Is
don't know,
that?
but I don't
Yeah.
know. They got better than that, but
Okay.
the
Yeah.
lowest that I've seen over the other elections was 21%, and she's going to get lower than that for sure. So that doesn't make sense to me. To me, they should have replaced her along the line before. I mean,
Mm.
she spent 2 years sitting on her couch eating potato chips, just doing
Not
nothing.
opposing. Not
Not only
opposing.
was she
Yeah.
not opposing, she
Yeah.
was actually agitating for stricter measures. She wanted people on the island of Montreal to not be allowed to leave the island of Montreal.
Really?
She just had
Close the
ill-advised.
bridges?
Yeah, and it was like she didn't actually
Wow.
have to go to work at all because there was no National Assembly. So I don't know what she was doing. She was absolutely out of touch with everything. The obvious thing was that she figured she already had all the English votes in her pocket. So let's try to chase some French votes. So she just became a copy of
Mm.
all the other
Yeah,
parties.
that makes sense.
She supported Bill 96 and then regretted it and said, though we didn't support it. And to me, it's absolutely incoherent. The leadership is a disaster. And that's a big problem because that's the natural ruling party of Quebec.
It is,
And
yeah.
we
As we
don't
were
have
saying.
that. So we got the conservatives who actually quite like them a lot. The guy has great policies.
Eric Duhem is the
Yeah.
man's name.
So
Yeah.
the problem, I think, with the conservatives, why are they polling so low? After I think they went up to 19 and now they're back to
Do
14
you think
or
that's
something.
low?
Well, I mean,
It's a brand new
yeah,
party,
okay.
pretty much,
It's
right?
good for
I mean, they
Yes,
were,
I think it's
yeah,
low. Yes, I think it's low because in Quebec you can be zero and then go up huge. Like the
that's
NDP
true. Yeah, that's a
with
good point.
with
Yeah.
Leighton, he went on tout le monde en parle,
Yeah.
and then suddenly he was
It's
like
an
they won
explosion.
every seat in Quebec just
Yeah.
because he did one or two really good TV
Le Bon
appearances.
Jacques or whatever.
But
Yeah.
I have a sense that okay, Duhem is openly gay, which
Yeah.
obviously I don't care about that one bit. Doesn't bother me. But if we look at Andre Boisclair, do you remember this
Yeah.
guy? He was a
Snorted
PQ.
cocaine in his
Yes.
office in Quebec City and an openly gay.
He was
Yeah.
frequently complaining that the fact that he's openly gay is actually stopping him from. So I don't really know if
Good
this is an
question.
issue,
Yeah.
but if you watch Duhane being interviewed on TV, they are super hostile to him. They want to crucify
Yeah.
him,
It's
and
interesting.
that's a problem because
So you're suggesting a kind of like innate homophobia, maybe?
yes, I
Is
think
that could well be.
it's hard to interpret because okay. I believe that the Quebec TV really dictates everything in
Yeah.
Quebec. I mean, if you look at the viewership statistics of the province of Quebec, they're just glued to their TVs and watching Quebec content all day long, especially elderly people. And
they vote. Elderly people
and
vote more
if
than
you see
younger people.
the trusted host going after somebody in a very hostile way, you think that person must be bad. So regardless of what you're going to do in terms of a brilliant answer, and Duhane gives great answers to
Very
these
smart
attacks.
Yeah.
So it's a very unfortunate situation. So is it because the corporate media has been bought out by obviously all this the subvention, the free money they've been receiving, or is it because they don't like conservatives, or they sort of have a sort of subconscious chip on their shoulder against this weird gay guy who's running? I don't really know. It could be a combination of these things, but unfortunately,
you think it's going to conspire to them not because just to be clear to our listeners. The Conservative Party of Quebec was reformed in 2011, I believe, and it had been dissolved in 1930 or something into the Union Nationale. I mean, it hadn't existed for, I'm not sure. I think Quebec was probably the only province in Canada not to have a Conservative Party. It was
Yeah, it came out
probably
of nowhere. Yeah.
right. Came out well. They bumbled along, and according to some inside sources I have, there was a split. There's like a hardcore libertarian part of
Oh,
it,
is
and
it?
then there's a more
Yeah.
sort of centrist conservative in the sense of like what we think of in the federal conservative party. But just to be clear, to understand, so people will understand, with nine, even if they got 19% of the vote, in theory they could win 0 seats. Because if those votes are
That's true.
distributed
Yeah.
across the
Yeah.
province, if they get
Yeah.
22% here and 33% there or
Yeah.
whatever, they could still end up with 0 seats. And
Yeah.
it sort of sounds like, on the other hand, they seem to be making a play. I wanted to return to some stuff you said about the Liberals. It could well be. You mentioned how the Anglos vote for the Liberals. It's kind of like how in the United States, Black Americans just vote Democrat, and for the same reason. Basically the Democrats hold up a sign saying, if you vote for the hairy, smelly white guys in the Republican Party, they're all gonna put y'all back in chains. Basically, right? So there's literally, the numbers are shocking. It's like what, 92, 96% voting Democrat, and it's very similar in Quebec. Anglophone community is. I'm not suggesting Anglophones are some persecuted minority or
Yeah.
anything like that, but that's a separate discussion. But I think what one of the things the Conservative Party is trying to do is smash that dependence, because the Liberals have been doing the same thing for the last 50 years. They've been saying, if you vote for the other party, you're going to end up in a different
Mm.
country. You don't want to live in a different country. You want to keep your country of Canada. So, do you think they can be successful at winning some seats on the island of the Conservative Party, at taking some seats from the Liberals? Do you think there's any possibility that could happen, or
No,
have
but
the
you make a good
Liberals?
point. It has to be,
Yeah.
their support has to be concentrated. I didn't go
Because
through riding by
with
riding.
Bill 96, they're
Yeah.
making a deliberate play to try and get some seats in the Anglo community. I
Yeah, and
believe,
I
right?
mean, when they talk
They've
about Bill
opposed Bill
96,
96. Yeah,
yeah, they oppose Bill 96, and I salute them for it. But his reasoning,
it's a bold move.
I totally admire him. It's not. He says it is a violation of the Charter of Rights, Human Rights and Freedoms of Quebec and Canada, the whole thing. So we on those grounds we oppose it. He doesn't say we
We'll
feel sorry for
repeal
the
it.
English people or anything.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
But he doesn't even say he'll repeal it, right? He
I don't
just
know what he
says,
says.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Anyway, yeah, that's a technical point. But anyway, sorry. What
Yeah,
were you?
I
Yeah,
actually saw
yeah.
an interview with Dominique Anglade, and it was like she said, we voted against Bill 96, but the interviewer, I was pulling my hair out. The next question, of course, will you repeal it if you're voted? But she didn't ask that. She just changed the sentence. So it was like, come on, man, we want to know.
Get your. Yeah, I mean, my impression of Anglade is, first of all, she's a very attractive woman. That doesn't. I don't know if that matters, if that
And her
helps her
parents died
electability.
in an
It's
earthquake in Haiti, so
really, yeah.
that got a lot of
I mean,
sympathy.
that doesn't mean anything about her as a politician. It's just I've seen pictures of her. She's sort of striking, like for someone. Usually, you're looking,
Yeah.
like
Once,
Legault is, you look at him and you see a picture of her.
once
It's like,
again,
wow,
like I don't want to mischaracterize, but it's like the fact is Quebecers are not necessarily that welcome. Like I said, the Bois Clair / Duhaime gay situation, I
yeah.
do believe it also goes over to they don't want to know about a black candidate. I
Is she
mean,
black? Because she sort of, yeah.
she's
Is she
black. Yeah,
part? Because
she's
she
black.
half or something? Yeah,
She's a light skinned black
light
person,
skin.
but
Yeah,
so
okay.
she's of Haitian
All right.
heritage. So I
Okay.
don't think that's working in her favor, even though it's it's
Yeah.
the woke
Um,
thing nowadays.
among the French Canadian majority, you're
And
talking
yet,
about,
you
right?
saw
Is that
interesting characters like Melanie Joly when she ran for mayor of Montreal. She was
did
an
really
absolutely
well?
nobody and did
Yeah.
insanely
Yeah.
well. And for somebody who was a no, so there is
And then it catapulted her
yeah
into the stratosphere
into
and
the
the federal.
evil realm
Yeah,
of the Trudeau circle, which is like
yeah.
I think they'll have to pay the price for that one day. Answer some hard questions, but
We'll
yeah,
come back to the federal
yeah,
stuff in a future podcast.
yeah.
Yeah. But just the thing about Anglade, I wanted to say is, do you think the liberals know that she's going to get smoked and that she's incompetent and that she's just their sacrificial lamb? I mean,
Yeah,
just
of
by
course.
way of comparison, I don't know if Mark Stein.
Mhm.
Mark Stein had this thing in sort of it was in 2020. He was analyzing who the Democrats were going to choose for the American election. Right? I don't know if I've told you this before, but and he was, and at that point, right before the not 2020, it was well, it was sort of late 2020 when it looked like Trump was just going to roll into a steaming victory. That's what it was looking like.
Mhm.
So he was saying that basically the Democrats were like, okay, who are we going to offer up for sacrifice? Like
Right.
we have to put someone up there, and that
Right.
person really has to think he could win or whatever. And he thought that they would put Joe Biden up
Mhm.
as that sacrificial lamb. And it's quite possible that they and he was in by then, that he was never supposed to be the president. He was supposed to be the guy who was going to get stomped by
Yeah, yeah,
Trump.
yeah,
So I
sure.
wonder, I just to get back to all of that, I wonder if she, and of course then the COVID thing happened.
Mhm.
And then that just was the catalyst, and then all the other stuff. I think the George Floyd stuff, that was another thing. But just to get back, like, do you think that she's some sort of, is that possible? They know she stinks and she's
Yeah, yeah, that's
incompetent,
standard practice. You
and
just
that they're
put
just
that.
putting her up there. She's going to get
You could
smoked.
say
And
you had the female one, and you get the double thing. And if she was in a wheelchair, it'd be a triple thing. So the point is,
well,
what?
that she can get smoked, and
Yeah,
then
of
there are
course.
people who might be able to win are not, because
Yeah,
the Mark Stein's point was that you don't put up someone who has a chance of like a
yeah,
real
of
chance of
course.
winning, because then their career is done. Once they've been stopped, they have to leave, right?
Yeah.
So, right, I don't know who the liberals have in terms of talent that they could offer up, right?
Okay, I know
I
that
don't
under
know.
Couillard they had a ton of people that were really good. This was it Leite, who was the finance. He was doing all
The
sorts.
Brazilian,
My God, this guy was brilliant, and he was
or
keen to
Portuguese,
keep. He was wanted to help the CAQ. He was like offering to. So this guy would have been a great.
Carlos
Yeah, he
Leite,
would have been brilliant. I mean,
yeah,
the Couillard himself would have been good if he hung around, but he had better things to do. He's going to make money as a doctor. I mean, for God's sakes, why didn't we keep this guy? But yeah, I
yeah,
mean, the whole thing is
yeah, yeah.
it's a mystery to me. But you know, Couillard, I guess when Legault was on TV every damn day talking about his COVID thing, and everybody in Quebec is watching their LCI or whatever it is, the Radio Canada news channel. I mean, that gave him so much screen time that they kind of he became endearing to them. That would be my only sort of attempt to understand how it is he maintains his massive popularity in Quebec, which is absolutely beyond my comprehension
So,
because I think he's entirely incompetent.
so you think COVID helped him,
Well, sure, because like I
right?
said, he was
Because
on
it,
TV all the
yeah,
time, and they're doing
right.
this gravitas thing, like, "Oh boy, I'm going to save the
Yeah,
world."
the kind of the very kind of the grandfather who's sort of looking out for his family,
Yeah,
with his glasses on the end of his
yeah, and
nose,
he's like
kind of,
one of us. He looks like my
yeah,
son-in-law or something. I don't know. It's something like that.
yeah. I don't really know how to think about that, because the COVID thing seems like a disaster. Did you want to just finish up on healthcare? Like, because we started with that, we didn't go into it. I mean, do you have any predictions about, I just wanted to say something about the healthcare, that you're right. There was a time when it was in all the newspapers and
Mhm.
people talked about it, and everybody seemed to agree that there was a demographic problem, that we have people
Mhm.
who
Yeah,
are baby boomers who are reaching, and they set the system up in 1965 or whatever, when the average, age was 65, you died, or
yeah,
66 or whatever it was. And there was a much younger population anyway. Like, even, even if you discount the earlier death rate, you had a higher youth bulge. So it was, and you add to that the rising cost of technologies like MRI machines and things like this,
hmm
that
hmm
are
hmm
so
yeah,
expensive,
sure.
right? And it's kind of one of these things. And the third problem is we have what's called single payer, which is basically there's one insurer, the government, right? So there's no way for market forces of competition to have any effect. And I don't know if you know this, but you know how people can't get a doctor, it's like a big
Hmm.
problem.
Yeah,
You will find, you go around the island of Montreal, you can find clinics that desperately need patients. They don't have enough patients. They've just opened up and they need new patients, and you can get in there. That's a real thing. And why don't we know about that? Because they're not allowed to advertise. It's again,
oh,
there's no way they can get, so they have to rely on sort of word of mouth and this kind of thing. And
mhm.
so it could, and Canadians, this is luckily not so bad in Quebec, but it's still a thing in Quebec, seem to have this almost talisman like thing about the healthcare
Yeah,
system. It's kind of like, we are better than our American cousins because we have this system. So doing any kind of reform that would lead to more market forces. I mean, we do have private healthcare in Quebec. It's very expensive. If you want to go to TMR and go to a clinic, I went into a clinic once I had a thing from a doctor, to get some blood tests. And, I lived in Park X. So I went in this clinic and it looked like Xanadu in there. There was bamboo and everything. And I didn't know it was a private clinic. I just walked in and I was like, yeah, I need to get these tests done. They took one look at me and they're like, sir, are you sure you want to do them here? I said, why? They said, well, you can go and get them done at the CLSC for free. And I said, really? Okay, so how much is it going to cost you? And it was like $1,000 or
Wow.
something. Yeah. Anyway, do you think there's a place, should someone be talking about some sort of reform, like really serious reform,
Yeah.
or is that crazy?
I don't know enough about what would work and what wouldn't work. I know that they talk often about let's make it semi-private, like this is what they do in Sweden, and that works so well there.
Switzerland. Yeah,
And it's
Germany,
like,
much better. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
like I said, will that work? I know that the Liberals got a bad reputation for healthcare after the Journal de Montréal published articles about some old person dying in some home, didn't get a bath for a couple of days, and that became like, wow, it's so shocking. But it's like, it seemed to me like it's sort of very trivial when you kind of think of it in the big picture. But somehow that sort of like bad publicity kind of really hits a nerve with the electorate, and somehow the CAQ has dodged that bullet. But I mean, inevitably it will be
Why?
there.
Sorry
I
to
don't know.
stop you. Did you have any theories why they don't
My
support?
theory is that they
Yeah.
know how to control the media a bit better. It's like
Right,
they're
right, yeah,
controlling the
yeah,
narrative a little bit more forcefully than perhaps their predecessors, who may have been
yeah, could
kind
be,
of
yeah,
dedicated to being a little bit more open.
yeah. That's sorry to interrupt you. I think that's probably what's going on because you're making a really good case that Legault and the CAQ are really good at watching polls and at playing to what people. So it could well be they seem to have a superb communication structure. I mean,
We're in dangerous territory
right?
about the media being bought out, the mainstream media
Yeah,
really being on the tit of government and stuff.
yeah, I
it's
agree.
quite obvious this is happening. I mean, you hear the COVID ads on the radio
Oh
nonstop. It's
God,
like, I mean,
it's
there's no,
infuriating to me. I changed
yeah,
the station
there's
when I,
no
yeah.
separation of church and state at all now, and it's like this is a big issue. So, do people like you or anybody
Yeah,
else out
maybe
there
getting the word
doing
out.
their voice, or even
Yeah, I've heard some. Just on that note, there, did one of these like open house days at the Cégep where I work, and so I was down there, greeting people, and I got into a discussion with one of the philosophy professors, who was a really smart guy, and we had a really cool talk, and we were talking about this exact issue about the COVID thing, and he said that the province of Quebec had spent more money on COVID than
mm,
any other province, even Ontario or all of the other ones combined. It was some shocking amount of money on that, on just these ads saying we need to do the couvre-feu there, the
yeah.
whatever curfew, and get vaccinated, this, that, the other thing, and it's funny how those things, like they sort of slip under the radar, because that seems like a serious conflict of interest.
Well,
It's
do you remember Sheila Copps? She was a liberal cabinet
yeah,
minister in the federal
yeah,
government. She had some program. She said, well, magazines in Canada, they could use a little help, so we're going to sort of like send money to them. And of course, she got not in trouble for it, but people,
conflict of interest.
yeah, it was like, this is
Yeah,
not really ethically okay. And yet nobody's asking those questions anymore
but
at
you and I
all.
are.
Yeah.
But we are. Yeah, yeah, because because I think the case of the COVID money, what you're suggesting is that basically the radio stations and the newspapers and the TV stations, that's not a direct subsidy, but that's something where, whoa, that's a nice little
Yeah.
bit of cash coming in to run these commercials, and it reinforces this notion to the population who's hearing them, if they're in favor of the government, that their government's kind of steady hand, carefully guiding us through this. They've got us covered. It's sort of saying, it's basically a political ad in some
Yeah.
senses, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sort
But
of
I don't
political.
like how do we know, to what degree does mainstream media control the people's points of view? I don't
Good
know.
question.
I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah.
obviously very powerful, but is it all powerful? I don't know.
Well, this is what I was getting at a few minutes ago when I mean, when I mentioned the 42%. I mean, there have been a lot of elections. I mean, the CA that where it seemed like there was this overwhelming thing. There was one in Alberta 10 years ago where I forget which party was going to dominate, and the other one won. When the CAQ won in 2018, the Liberals were supposed to first win a majority. Then the polls were showing a minority right up to election day.
Mm.
Everybody was saying it's going to be a minority. And then I remember the day of, I remember thinking, I don't know. And everybody I was talking to, I was talking to one woman who's a doctor, and she said, "Oh, it's just really." It was a French Canadian kind of person who's more plugged into the media than you and I are, let's say. And she was like, "Oh, I was just really disengaged from this. I didn't really even want to vote. And that was the sense I was getting. And the CAQ was quietly out there knocking on doors. They have a whole
Mm-hmm.
machine running, And I remember that friend of mine in Gatineau told me the day of. He said, "Boy, I went to the polls today, and it's worrying. Like just from the chatter he was hearing."
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I mean so the CAQ then they won this overwhelming victory with only 37% of the
Oh
population
my
voting
God, are
for them,
you
right?
joking? Is that the number? I didn't even know that.
37. Well,
Wow.
that's, I mean, just so we can get
Yeah.
this onto the record, our system is very strange where because it's first past the post in every single
Mm-hmm.
riding. So if
Mm-hmm.
you have 125 ridings, then every single one you can get 35, 45. You can get way under 50%. You take 100% of that
Sure.
particular district, right? So that happens federally and provincially. Federally, it's even stranger where the Conservative Party in two straight elections got more votes than the Liberal Party, and
Yeah.
they still
Yeah.
lost, right? Which
Amazing.
is
Amazing.
and under this system, the Parti Québécois in 1998 won a majority with fewer votes, which is sort of
Yes.
incredible. I mean, it's an
Incredible. Incredible. So,
so this is
yeah.
what the CAQ is banking on. They're banking on because of those distribution of those votes outside the island. They
Yeah.
happen to right.
I
I
suppose the Liberals
suppose
probably, while they had the power, they should have changed the
the
voting
electoral
voting
system.
map and say put a lot more seats on well populated areas like Montreal. That it doesn't make sense to me that we have the system where all the outlying areas are totally controlling all of the narrative. They're deciding what happens in Montreal. I mean, this is
Yeah.
everybody in his dog says the same thing. So I'm just stating the obvious, but we're in a very strange system where all these people from who don't like Montreal and don't trust Montreal get to dictate Montreal's policies. It doesn't make sense to me.
It could be that the government has too much power generally. Like that.
Mm,
That might be
yeah.
that would be my argument as a
Yes.
kind of libertarian,
Yeah.
almost quasi anarchist type. Is that the whole idea that there's such a large state sector in Quebec. Like maybe that's the problem, and so many people, I say this. I'm almost an employee of the state in some
Yeah.
sense. I'm an educator, but I don't know about that. As to reforming the system, I'm going to ask Roy Epen about that tomorrow
Yeah.
because he's the. I don't know what to think because it is. You have to be careful because the system. If it really. I mean, is it really that bad? We generally have a pretty stable democracy. I mean, every system you have
Yeah.
every system that is set up democratically is not going to work perfectly. Like in the sense of one person, one vote, right? So I don't know. I like as to reforming the system. Like if I had to make a proposal that would be better, I don't know that I could do that without making like it might make it worse. Whatever I came up with or what
Well,
you
no,
could
I
come
think
up
you
with,
what you
right?
would do, any sane person would do is like let's scale back on a lot of these rules. So it's like what we got, for example, is the CAQ comes in, they want to leave their mark, and they have this policy that French people won't be allowed to go into English CEGEPs, except that it's slightly more complicated than that. But
People who've gone to elementary and secondary school in French. They're not French
voila,
necessarily,
so
right?
that's
They
actually
would have to go to a French language cégep, and then
it's
university would be okay. But
the
yeah,
PQ never wanted to do that because they said that's just going too far. And yet, out of the blue, the
CAQ.
CAQ comes up with this policy, and it's not even popular amongst French people. You know that, eh? The French people don't like this. English people, of course, hate it. Like, why would you do that? And but they did it anyway, just for I guess because they
Is
said they
that done now?
yeah,
Is that a
so
done deal?
yeah, sure.
You
So they
sure? Yeah. Okay.
basic. I think it is, unless
Yeah.
you probably know better than me, but
Well,
I think it
yeah,
is. Yeah.
I know a little bit about this in the sense that the because I'm an educator in one of the French language CEGEPs, and I should say for the record that my view here may be biased because I may benefit from that,
Sure.
right? Because the way it works right now is the English educational institutions in Quebec are more established historically. They like the first educational institutions in Quebec, aside from heavily religious
Hmm.
things,
Hmm.
were like secular institutions like McGill, and also the colleges like Dawson are older and they were not they were secular to begin with. The
Hmm.
French ones were. So what I think what that translates into is in the modern era they tend to be better. They tend to be
Right.
better at doing education because it wasn't this heavy religion up until 50 years ago or whatever. That's my analysis of. And one of the results of that is that Dawson College and Vanier College. There's what, three colleges on the island of Montreal,
Hmm.
right? Dawson, Vanier, and John Abbott, right?
Right.
They have way more students applying to get in, which means they
Sure.
can take better students. Right?
Sure.
They can pick, which means that that's another reason they're
Yeah.
better. They
Yeah.
have
Sure.
students that are smarter, like higher grades and all that stuff. So what? And many of the students who go to those English language institutions are not Anglophones, right? Many of them
Right. Yeah.
are, as you
Sure.
mentioned, French Canadians. Now, as to whether the government should mandate, I don't know that that has been done. I do know that the English language setups like Dawson, they're supposed to have some. If you get your diploma there, you have to do at least three of your core
Yes.
courses in French.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's say so maybe you could take biology. You're studying a whole bunch of biology courses. One of them would have to be in French, right?
Yeah, absolutely stupid. I mean, that's
Yeah,
just well, what is that?
yeah.
People, I mean, if you actually go around and talk to people, it's like they're not that. People are not always that bilingual as you imagine. They always like,
Well, yeah,
there's a lot of people whose
who
French
would have
is.
trouble with
I
that.
mean, I've got
Yeah, that's
neighbors who
true.
don't speak
Yeah.
English or French. They've been here for 50 years. They speak Italian, and it's like they could say a few words in both, but it's
Yeah.
this is it's
We have a very linguistically diverse environment
yeah,
in this city. I think that, I mean, because I think that I understand that first of all, the objection to it to me would be that it would be logistically very hard to do. How would you integrate those teachers in? Like when I think about my institution, if we had to give some courses aside from like I'm in the languages department, so
sure,
that's what we do. But if in the biology department,
yeah,
like they don't, like would I go in and teach a biology class or something just because I can speak English fluently?
good point.
Like how would that work on the French language system? Would
Yeah.
they, But the objection that some students are not linguistically capable enough is an indictment of the school system, in my view. That it's not like that. It's the Anglophone school system is not preparing people well enough for the Francophone majority. That's my personal
Okay,
view.
so fair
You
enough,
know,
but keep in mind there are 47 or 48 or something English-speaking people in Canada and the U.S. for every one
yeah.
French-speaking person. So the idea is that we've got to sort of the English
But
people.
we're here though,
Yeah, well,
right?
we're here
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
moment. We can
yeah.
we can go
That's
any
true.
different place, and
That's
we want to
true.
optimize ourselves for the world, not for necessarily for
Well, I
Quebec.
mean,
Come on.
you could look at Quebec as a French-speaking North America is what you said. What 6% of North America speaks French as a native language. 23% of 22% of Canada, and what, over 80% of Quebec speaks it as a native language, right? Because of about 78% are French Canadians, and then there's a few percentage points of people who are not French Canadians who use French as their primary
Mm.
language, right? A lot of people in Montreal North and places like that, where so that's a huge majority here. Here, I mean, wouldn't you concede that that's important where we live? Is that not?
No, I don't think
No,
so.
yeah,
Look, I
yeah,
mean, like
yeah,
for example, on my Facebook page, I look at my feed, and I've got all sorts of people from Montreal. I've got a lot of Haitians, whatever, Africans. I've got people in Montreal just because I'm interested in those people, and they'll switch to English all the time, even though they're French, basically. And it's like
yeah,
suddenly they're talking in English. But why do the French people get the English tattoos? It's like it's a fun thing. They want to do that. They want to be in the world, and it's like
yeah.
this is the way we should be swimming.
Yeah, I can tell you that. I mean, my personal experience with my students, and many of whom become my friends
Hmm.
after they've finished. I mean, I went over to get my hair cut with one today, and he's half French Canadian and half Italian, and so we were talking about this, and I asked him straight up. I said, "How many of?" Because he speaks more French than English. I mean, he speaks English quite fluently because
Hmm.
but but he's more comfortable in French, let's
Right.
say. But he's one of these people, like you're talking about, who has no problem just going into English. He doesn't care. He doesn't. It's not like he's like. But I asked him. I said, "How many of in the Italian side of your family? Because how many of them use?" English, prefer to use English over French, and he said, "Oh, like 98%,"
Sure.
yeah,
Sure. Yeah.
which was I would have said like 75%. So,
Well, okay. I mean,
but
history.
among the
Yeah.
Italian community,
But you know
was,
the history was
yeah,
basically they were sort of forced into the English schools for
yeah,
whatever. I
yeah.
never really understood the reason for that. They're Catholic, and
That's a great question because
they were
Italians are Catholic. Why would they have been put? Yeah,
they were
just because they were
rejected.
immigrants, I
To
guess.
me,
Yeah,
it's mystifying. It's like the
yeah,
whole the grip of the clergy and some of the administrative decisions over the centuries. To me, have been incredibly mystifying. Like they discouraged education. The clergy
yeah.
actually
That's
they
right.
actively discouraged education. I go,
In your book, you have some stories
yeah,
about that, about how they were going to build a
yeah,
library.
yeah.
Can you tell that? Because that's a really
Yeah,
incredible.
what's the industrialist in the states who's
Vanderbilt
no,
was it?
no, yeah,
No,
anyway,
yeah,
anyway,
it was a big American industrialist.
he said that
Yeah,
he was going to fund libraries all over the place. You
in
just
New
all
York
they
and
had to
everywhere. Yeah,
all they had to do was staff them. So Ontario got like 150 of these libraries, and we absolutely blocked these libraries. If you look at the history of the Cercle Canadien, which is another thing, they excommunicated them because they wanted to be learning, and these
yeah.
people. So there was a whole scandal about that. So Monsignor Bruchesi, I think his name was, who the big top guy in about 1908 in Quebec. He of the Catholic Church. He said it's 1,000 times worse than smallpox to be
To learn English,
yeah
yeah, to become. Yeah, wow.
to libraries. So he was
The
saying
libraries. Okay, so
libraries are a
books.
thousand. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
the point is, if we're in that freaking crazy psychotic situation where they were actually discouraging people from learning and reading, it's like that's a
Yeah,
major hindrance on your population. And yet,
definitely.
at the
Yeah.
same time, I admire them because they really did get their population numbers up. They really got those 14
Very high
kids per family.
fertility.
It was
Yeah,
insane,
right.
and it's like that's almost like a curse because now they kind of expect to keep that, but they can't because they're not having kids anymore, and so they're relying on the immigrants to be their new babies, but the immigrants who really have other ideas. So another thing I was following up on was I saw that Legault had announced that he was spending $4 billion on filling all these jobs, and I'm like, what is he going to do? I was like, I assumed that he was going to go to Tunisia and Algeria and find francophones from other countries to fill these jobs, but that's not it at all. What he's actually planning to do is just educate the people in the local French Canadian people into doing these jobs. So he's just going to go out and find, okay, we need people
But
in
there's not enough people to
construction.
do
Yeah,
it.
I
Yeah,
don't. So
so it
this is
doesn't
his
make any
idea. So
sense.
that's a lot of money to be throwing at this problem, man. To me, it's like,
Sounds like pork.
oh,
Sounds like it's basically a way of
yeah,
spreading pork
they got
around.
to open. To me, they got to open the immigration floodgates, and
Yeah.
they know that that's the road to hell because so
This,
many of these people
yeah.
will be switching over to English. You know?
Well, this is what I wanted to get back to. Like, I think that this, it's kind of like I think what happened in with the Bill 101 is that this is just directly relating to separatism. Was the idea was okay, the fertility rate's collapsing, so what we need to do is get the immigrants into French schools, and they will learn French and they will integrate into French. And I think if you're looking at it from the sovereigntist point of view, they're going to become good little sovereigntists and just going to kind of join our ranks or whatever. And it did work in the sense that it has created a cohort of people. It's unclear to me the numbers, but there's some number, a significant number of non-French Canadians who are francophones, a lot
Mm.
now, who are multi-generational, and they're not fully integrated into the French Canadian community because they don't they don't have the same heritage, let's say, but they use French as their language. So I'm not sure that I think it's a very outmoded idea to assume that all the immigrants just want to integrate into English because I don't see that in
Well, I
my,
think okay. I know, but hold
it,
on. I
yeah,
didn't say they all want to, but
yeah,
certainly
some
a
do,
significant
some do,
percentage
some
do.
do,
So
yeah,
it's like they that's not what so they don't have a solution to this issue, which is basically there's an issue all countries around the world of underpopulation. Not all
definitely,
countries,
yes, yes,
Nigeria, Egypt, they don't
no,
have
no, yeah,
they don't
but
have a problem.
Japan,
Yeah, so
Italy, Germany, including this country,
we
yeah,
got that problem
yeah,
plus the language thing. How are we going to keep this language going? Which I would personally say, look, stop worrying about language. Just don't even worry about it. It's fine.
yeah,
It doesn't make a difference.
yeah.
People speak English or French. I don't understand why it's their obsession. That
Yeah,
I don't get it.
I know that you have a somewhat of an unusual view
Yeah,
that it would be better if the entire province of Quebec became Anglophone,
yeah.
but
It'd be
just
better for them, but
yeah, no, but we'll put that to the side. But just the numbers are somewhat obscure because I don't know if you know Andrew Cadell. He's a journalist, and I found out from him not long ago that
oh yeah,
Yeah, 8% of us are like you and me. Like we are, like we went to school in English and we spoke English with our families in the home. That's like de souche anglophone. About 8%, 8 or 9%. But there's actually, if you ask people which of the two official languages do you prefer to use and you use most often, you get about 13.5% in Quebec who say English.
Mm,
So that's people like some of these immigrants come in and they
sure.
learn how to speak French, but they live on the West Island or something, and they live in English, and so they use English. Even someone like Christian right? I
Mm,
mean, he's
yeah,
from the Abitibi, but he came to Montreal and he uses English. So
yeah.
it strikes me that there's a kind of a interplay going on between the two. I don't know. I hesitate to think that one of them has to rise up and dominate over the other one.
Well, I mean,
I
the
don't.
English is obviously the dominant language. It just
In
has
North
to be.
America,
Like,
but
let's
it's always been the
Okay,
case,
but even in
right?
Quebec,
Right.
if you put them side to side, it's like, for example, Duhame went on Jordan Peterson recently. I don't
Oh
think
yeah,
that they
really?
haven't
Oh,
actually put it on the air,
okay.
as far as I
Yeah.
know yet.
Looking
But
forward to
I was looking at
that.
the people in the French people on the internet were all like, "Oh, Peterson's great. I love Peterson." Blah blah blah, and they all had a point of view on Jordan Peterson, and they're the French Quebecers. So it's like you got an idea that they're not oblivious to this stuff. The internet is
Mm,
a huge
yeah.
attraction. I don't think there's that much happening. I'm not an expert of the Quebec podcasts and stuff. There's stuff in it.
There's some
Obviously
stuff.
there's
Yeah.
content, but there's nothing as big and
Jordan
magnificent as
Peterson
these
is a
that sort of thing.
superstar
These
across. Yeah.
the Joe Rogan type things. You're not going to get that in Quebec. There's going to be a few that are very popular, but so I don't know what that holds, but I suspect that it's going to lead to more
Yeah.
romanticization of the English language, which it's inevitable. That's where the action is. That's where the ideas are.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to finalize the thought on just the language. If I look ahead, I mean, if I were to look ahead to see the world that you'd like to see, to like in 200 years, if French were only spoken in tiny villages and English just were the norm everywhere, I'm not sure. I don't like the look of that. I don't want that to happen. But that's okay. I mean, because also both of us will be gone by then anyway, so we won't
Oh,
know,
I can see
right?
the charm in it
Yeah,
personally.
yeah,
I
you
always
know,
come back to my ancestral homeland of Wales,
yeah,
and it's
yeah,
like what a beautiful English they speak, and it's
yeah.
like they've enhanced themselves and the English language and culture to such a massive degree. And I'd love to see the Quebecois people doing the same thing. It would be
With
great.
English. Yeah, I mean, because I think Thomas Sowell wrote a lot about that in some of his essays about Wales and also about Ireland. I mean, if Ireland's a very interesting case because their language, collapsed and disappeared over a fairly quick period in the late 19th. Because apparently during the potato famine, most of the immigrants coming here didn't speak English. Apparently, this is not well known,
Hmm.
and it wasn't. And so when you get to the end of the 19th century, there was the English was imposed on the school systems at one point, and then it just but what's interesting is so there was a period where the Irish people basically went through a transition within a couple of generations. So there would have been people who wouldn't have been able to talk to their grandparents very easily, like say 100 years ago.
Oh,
And
interesting.
during that period, you have this incredible literary flourishing
Sure.
of James Joyce,
Oh,
and
yeah.
also the Irish are in their culture they have a very naturally social, the gift of gab and that
Sure.
stuff is big. So that applied into politics and writing, and so you could argue that the Irish people's talents were opened up to the United Kingdom in a certain way by that, but that's a separate discussion. I'm not sure I'd want to have it here. Okay, so to get back to closing this out, just one thing I wanted to say about the polls and all that was this friend of mine who cuts my hair, and he's my former student. He told me he's watching this election really
Mm.
closely. He said there were some really good singers in the debate between Duhem and Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, where it was I think it was. Nadeau-Dubois said, "Oh, maybe you should go run in Texas, because you're this conservative. We don't do that here." And he said, "Well, maybe you should go run in Cuba."
I
I just shot right
didn't
back.
even know that. I
Yeah,
didn't
which
know
is
about
great.
that. That's great.
And so that was a good line.
That's great.
And I tried to find the clip. I was trying to because
That's
I'm
great.
not following this election that closely, but that's why I have you here. You're my resident expert. But he told me that he was monitoring it on Facebook, and he said that Quebec Quebec Solidaire and the PQ
Yeah.
was it were getting the most kind of action and likes and kind of like
Yeah, it's interesting to see.
so
Yeah,
I
like
wonder if that means does that
I have
put
a
a
I have a
you know
bias because those parties don't interest me one bit. And the Quebec Solidaire and the PQ, I
oh
don't see
god.
there's much difference between them. What is the difference? I don't
Well,
know.
Quebec Solidaire is the left wing of the PQ used to be CAQ, PQ, and Quebec Solidaire. They were all under the PQ tent
Mm-hmm.
up
Mm-hmm.
until what 10, 15 years ago, right?
Right.
So the Quebec Solidaire is the left wing urban
Sure,
kind
but
of like
how does it serve them to be separate from the PQ? Because both of them
great question.
don't have a
Yeah.
chance at all. You know, it doesn't. I don't see the point of it. So
But I mean, do you like? I just wonder hearing that. Like, is there a kind of discontentment among that might translate into QS is going to do pretty well? I think they're going to. I mean, well in the sense that they might get a couple dozen seats at most, right? Um, the real question is, will it eat into any of the CAQ? Will it, or could it be a
yeah.
minority? Like, I don't think they're going to lose. I
I
think,
honestly, if they have
right?
no, I think the CAQ has an absolute majority in the bag based on what I saw. But so, in other words, it makes it all very kind of like it doesn't really matter to me if
Arcane, yeah, right.
one party gets 6 seats or 7 seats or 9 seats or 11 seats. But it's all just the same thing. Like where did like we saw discontent with the COVID mandates and stuff and various other things, and yet we don't see it really translating into real kind
Yeah.
of action in the election. It doesn't seem to have. I don't get it at all. I don't. Where
You
did
don't
it
have any
go?
theories? Because that's a great question. Why is there not more? There was a lot of discontent in Quebec
It
for
was massive. Sure.
there was a
Yeah.
lot of people like really upset with this. The trucker convoy was
Yeah.
fairly popular
Yeah.
among the population here. So there was that Rambo Gauthier guy, organizing all the
Yeah.
truckers and
And
everything.
where are
So
those votes going? I don't know. I don't get it.
yeah,
I don't get it.
yeah, no, it's a so you don't have any prediction. Do you think it matters if, let's say, the CAQ, if they're, like if they, let's say get, they don't win as big as as we think they're going to win, and the conservatives and some of these other parties,
Mhm.
if they gain some seats, do you think that has some indication for the future? Do you
I don't know
have
what the
any theory?
CAQ what is it they're promising to do their goals I mean they obviously they're the party that wanted to get rid of the veils and they wanted to do a few
Yeah, the
more
identity stuff.
yeah the
That's a big part of
language
their, yeah,
laws and
yeah.
so it
That
seems
that's their brand,
so they've
right?
already
Yeah,
done that. Like the
yeah,
liberals, when they were there, they were doing a lot of big projects, and that was sort of
yeah.
like they're sort of the business party. But I don't know what the CAQ is. I saw. I was too bored to read it through. Basically, they have
Their
a bunch of
platform.
big spending, and they're going to do this, that, and the other. But it doesn't seem like they've got a real vision of what they're going to do now. Are they going to make even more intense language laws? Like what's there left to
What's
do? You
next?
know.
Yeah,
I
what's
know
next?
he has said in the
Yeah,
past that he only wants to do one mandate or two mandates and then retire. But of course, once you're in power,
yeah. Of
you want
course,
to keep
that's
going forever. He's the
yeah.
new Duplessis, right?
That's you're raising a really good question. But one thing I'm taking away from this conversation is sort of the horrifying realization that they are. When Jordan Peterson rants about and Maxime Bernier too has ranted this idea of just polling the population and figuring out
Yeah,
instead of like we said a minute like I was saying a minute ago, here are what my beliefs are.
sure.
Here they are. Do you agree with them? And if you don't, that's okay. They're doing the reverse. It's like I'm a blank page, and I'm going to look at you and try and reflect you back in my I'm going to try and create a mirror of you so you're happy
Yeah.
at seeing your
Well, the new
something,
government
right?
technique is you leak some nonsense out to the newspapers or whatever. Your government, like in Canada, it would be the CBC. Trudeau did specifically this. You leak something out to them, they'll report it, and then you use that report to justify your
Right, right,
policy, which
right.
is like and they've been doing this elsewhere in the states. I'm sure they do it in Quebec as well. Because so the whole thing
Well,
is,
they did something a little bit. Francois Legault did something a little bit like this, where he made this quote unquote gaffe about foreigners or something recently, just
mhm,
last
mhm.
week, and he had to walk it back and apologize because all they all piled on about how it's racist. I don't have the exact words, but it happened. Anyone could look it up. And apparently he said something about, immigrants or something, and it was sort of like interpreted that he was being xenophobic, and he had to apologize. So he made some comment like, "Oh, I was misunderstood, and this is what I really meant," and blah blah blah. But it occurred to me as soon as I heard that from my colleague at work, she told me she heard it on CJAD. I thought that wasn't a mistake.
Mm,
He said that deliberately, knowing that his people out, they're going, okay, he's sticking up for
yeah,
our interests. He's
yeah.
with
That's
us.
obviously.
It wasn't a racist comment, but it was just, I mean, anything people call racism right now over the most
You gotta get
mundane, minute things,
some
right?
of the
So,
great quotes
you know,
in politics, whether it's a Parizeau called Quebecers lobsters,
yeah.
and the ethnic vote, and Bouchard said we need more white babies. So once in a while they come out with these sort of like honest things that's like it's almost refreshing as they're going to say what they really mean, you know. So yeah,
That's kind of what he was doing.
yeah,
he was more or less saying some sort of thing about one of these identity things that people would say, would a reasonable person go, okay, well, that's one point of view. It's, maybe a little bit, it's politically incorrect, let's say. But then, of course, he got piled on. But I just think it wasn't a mistake, just about this
yeah. It
messaging. I
would
think,
sound.
yeah, that he.
I would concur. I mean,
Okay, just to close, so you don't have any official prediction of any kind. You don't, are
well,
you
I predict
gonna,
Dominique Anglade of the Liberals will be gone as soon as this thing, and I'd be curious to see if they can actually put together an interesting team because the Liberals should probably be a much larger force than they are, and it's like I just hate to think that we've got 4 more years of the CAQ coming around the bend and just this more sort of unfocused, low intelligence kind of vulgar,
mm,
brutal sort of government that doesn't really do anything good for at least for English people or Montreal people or freedom or business. It's just
yeah.
very discouraging right now.
I think that's a really good point. This is something that I should mention before we close is I'm very impressed and happy with the return in Canada of the notion of freedom, right? The
Yeah.
idea that freedom is like, I think for a long time, many Canadians have this view. They look at the United States that really trumpets up freedom as an important part of
Hmm.
their
Even
national
France as
identity.
well, Liberté, you know.
Right. France and the United States have a very Republican, but especially the US. So I think many Canadians look at that and think, oh, freedom, that's sort of a dirty concept. We believe in peace and order and all this
Mm.
stuff. And the reality is that yes, it's true that many rednecks in the US are into freedom. Okay, that's true. But there's a long history of, for in Canada of people supporting freedom, the concept of freedom. I mean, Wilfrid Laurier,
Mm.
one of his quotes, I don't know if you ever heard it was something like Canada is freedom and freedom is its nationality or something. It
I
was a
didn't know that. I
yeah,
never
it was
heard
a
that.
direct and we fought for freedom in several wars
Mm.
around the world and most notably against the Nazis.
S- s-
So I mean this is so just to close the thought on freedom. The Freedom Convoy was called the Freedom Convoy.
sure.
The Conservative Party have their slogan is
Yeah.
"Libre chez nous,"
Libre chez nous. Yeah.
yeah,
Good. Good slogan.
which is a great slogan. It's
Yeah.
got the word freedom, and it's sort of hearkening. It's also connecting
The
it to,
maître chez nous.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's connecting it back to, was that the Union Nationale
Yeah.
that
That
had
would have
that?
been Duplessis.
It was a Duplessis.
I
No,
think so. Am
no,
I right?
I'm not sure if it was
Anyway,
Duplessis. I think it was in the 60s. It was
maître
what
chez nous.
I
Okay.
yes, I think it was the Union
After Duplessis.
Nationale trying to co-opt the rising separatist movement.
Okay.
Like so,
Okay.
they were kind of thinking, okay, there's this separatist movement coming up, so we'll promote this idea that we can be masters of our own house is what it
Sure.
translates to,
Yeah.
right? But I think that what the idea of freedom in our own house is an even
Okay,
better idea. You know,
we have a charter of rights and freedoms, and it shouldn't be abused, and yet it was abused really
that's true.
terribly, left and
Speaking
right,
of
center,
freedom,
Quebec
yeah,
and
yeah,
federal. So it's like when it's not just it's an imaginary thing. It's like we had actual major government abuses of our rights, which should never be freaking done, and yet they do it left, right, and center, and it's not cool.
so this has to be denounced as a part of this election. That you and I are saying this. It seems like the Conservative Party seems to be the most
Mm.
pronounced, the Conservative Party of Quebec, on this front. So maybe if there is something positive to end on, maybe this is the beginning of a kind of new movement where freedom reasserts itself, and
Yeah.
maybe that will translate because it's not going to happen this election, right?
It doesn't look
Right.
like it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But maybe in the future, maybe this is the beginning.
But
I
I
don't
mean,
know. Is
it's
that
possible that people seem to be okay. Obviously, with the transgressions against the freedoms, I don't know understand why, but the bubble could burst eventually. People could say they're just going doing too much, going too far.
well?
Hopefully,
Well, some of that might be. I mean, part of it is, as we mentioned a minute ago, there was a lot of boiling rage against that. I
Yeah.
mean, I heard people like even francophones who were very opposed to it. In French Canada, there's a strong emphasis on consensus in that
Yes.
culture,
Good
right?
point.
So it's
Yeah.
very, it's not the kind of culture where, like, if you just sort of imagine a stereotypical Christmas dinner at a Quebecois household
Mhm.
somewhere, it's not the kind of place where it's not like a Jewish household where there's going to be all this arguing and yelling. It's going
Mhm.
to be more relaxed discussion. If they're going to talk about these political things, it's
Yes.
going to be, they're
Yes.
going to listen to what Pepper says, and then they're going to respond. And if they do have an opposite, something opposed to the
Yeah.
consensus, they're going to keep it to themselves, but it will reassert itself at some point. I think. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes
I think it's
sense.
interesting
You know.
observation. Like I was watching this movie called Starbuck, which is a, story. I think it's from another place, but it was adapted to Montreal and Quebec. And it was about a guy who was a sperm donor who learns that he has 500 kids, even though in his real relationship he doesn't have kids, and he's a loser. So it's an interesting film to watch because it kind of exposes a lot of what the cultural values of Quebec insofar as, look, the guy is incompetent at his job, like criminally incompetent, just he's very bad in life,
But he's not fired, and it
but
doesn't
he
matter,
but
right?
he
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
nice.
right,
He's
right,
nice. In French, there's a word for that. The English word is smart, right?
hmm
Smart means intelligent. It
hmm
doesn't mean kind, but
right,
they
right.
use it in French, smat, smatte, te
Mm.
smat toi.
Just
It
smart.
means you're nice. It doesn't mean you're. So when
Interesting.
they
Yeah,
took the word smart
and
and
they
they
meant.
made it nice.
Yeah,
So
wow.
this is
That's an incredible observation. I've never noticed that in French. Yeah,
and there's another thing.
yeah.
Instead of saying nous,
They say on.
they say on. That
Yeah,
means, and that's like
that's
one does. So it's like
everybody. Yeah,
it's like the passive voice is like this is what one does. It doesn't mean it's like we are doing it. So that to me is another distinction. That so this movie Starbuck, it's like literally the fantasy of he's an immigrant speaking French on the island of Montreal. That's good for a couple points, right? And he's not an immigrant, but he's a Polish from a Polish family, and so that is a big fantasy of the French culture. We've got people in Montreal, right? We haven't lost the island yet. And at the end, and of course he's having a lot of babies. Wouldn't it be great if
yeah,
Quebecers
yeah,
had a lot
right.
of
Yeah,
babies? Wow. And the movie
yeah.
literally freaking ends with him and the 50 kids hugging each other in this
Wow.
mass hug. So it's like, it's not a James Bond movie where you're shooting people and, this is
It's a
like,
French language film.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
so
Interesting.
it kind of
Yeah.
tells
No.
it.
No. That's a really interesting observation. There's a strong sense family is really important among. Did you ever watch that show Les Bougons? Do you remember that?
I know about it.
That was a,
Yeah.
that was a it was a the story was a family in the East End of Montreal that basically lived their lives kind of on welfare and ripping off every system. They would go around, scamming government programs basically,
Mm-hmm.
and the word bougon in French. Have you ever heard that in Quebec?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what it means? It's a word that means, or bougon is someone who kind of is a scam artist. It's like a kind of and it's not really a family name, but in the show, it was like, Paul Bougon was the
Right,
guy's
right.
name. It was Rémi Girard, the
Yeah,
actor.
yeah,
Yeah. But in that show, there was a very interesting part, just speaking of this thing about family and bringing in new immigrants. One of the characters was this kid called Mao, and
right.
he was a little Chinese kid that they had
Yeah,
that was in the family.
yeah,
And apparently they found him at the port, like he was
right.
in one of the containers or something, and they were down there stealing
That's
something or something. And it's really a touching thing that this is maybe hope for this sort of integration of immigrants in some senses. Like, I really believe that French Canadians are not any more xenophobic than Anglo Canadians are. I just don't think that's generally true. But I do think they have a strong sense of their own community, and they have no problem if people come into that, if they really buy into that. If they really,
yeah,
that I think that's something. I mean, the Irish adopted, the children who were adopted
mm,
by, I think, is a good example. There was,
sure,
and I think maybe that's the message in that Starbuck, that
yeah,
they're like, this guy, his family came from Poland or whatever, but we're really happy to have him. I don't know if that's a fantasy. I think,
yes, yeah.
is that something you think is not realistic, or do
Well,
you,
no, I think the
you
larger
know,
question, I think that the French Canadian people have incredible kindness. And it's like when you meet them, to me, I really like the French
yeah,
Canadian people. They're always freaking nice to me, even though
me
I
too.
can be quite obnoxious.
It's your points of view on language, or
And
yeah,
yet, at
yeah,
the same time, some of their policies are just monstrous. I personally
yeah,
think some of these laws, language laws, and sort of basic things that get accepted here are just absolutely unacceptable. So it's like, to me, I think that, we have to differentiate between sort of compassion and kindness and sort of the
Yeah.
cruelty that can come about.
What I'm talking about is more of a social thing, like in Bougon with this little kid. This little kid's brought into the family, and he's one of theirs. They don't even think about it. They think, oh, the kid. They bring him in, and and what's interesting about that show is that there's this moral conundrum all the time of ripping off, but not feeling good about it. I don't know if that's a
Oh, is that right?
Catholicism.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very
Okay.
interesting show. It's really funny. I mean, it's
Mhm.
hilariously funny. It's just a situation comedy, basically, but it has a lot of really deep insights about.
The French
So,
Canadians also have like the sort of Falardeau was a big
oh,
at this,
great
right? He loved to
filmmaker. Yeah,
create these characters who were vulgar and hilarious, right?
that's right. Yeah,
And yet,
yeah.
I actually interviewed Falardeau,
Really?
and
Yeah.
I asked him, I said, like, I understand you're trying to push this message of Quebec separatism and all this,
This is
but
Pierre Falardeau, the great
yeah,
filmmaker who passed away about 10
Elvis
years ago.
Gratton would have been the
Right.
best known
Oh, yeah.
character, right?
Yeah.
It's a great movie. It's
And
very
he
funny.
dramatized the rebellions of 1837 in
Sure.
some of his films. But yeah,
So
anyway,
he was
yeah,
basically obsessed with
separatism. Yeah,
separatism. So I
yeah,
mean, I asked him. I said, "Well, how does this got to do with separatism?" As Elvis Gratton is like this funny, endearing guy. He's quite charismatic, and he's supposed to be a bit dumb and being a separatist. I mean, being a federalist.
Federalist.
We're
Yeah.
going to laugh at him for being a federalist, being vulgar, but he's so endearing that it doesn't make you hate him at all. It makes you probably more of a federalist if you watch the movie. So he didn't really have an answer.
He didn't have an answer.
He kind of had some answer, but it didn't make sense. But
That's
he sort of
interesting.
conceded
Yeah.
my point. The guy who played Elvis Gratton, who was there at the same interview, so whatever, he didn't have an answer either.
Okay, so we'll close with a positive prediction for the longer term and maybe a bit more of a apprehension for this election. And both of us, I think at this point, if I had to bet, I would bet on the CAQ winning probably a majority. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, a huge
Yeah.
majority, but I mean, I think the long term of Quebec, I think we've got some serious problems ahead. We got it's just not looking really good for us demographically, and we've sucked away a lot of our legitimacy in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. So I'm really quite discouraged about the state of affairs now. So if there's any good news on the horizon, I'd be happy to celebrate it.
Well, one final point on that. Demographics can change very quickly that way. I mean, Israel is a famous case where 30 or 40 years ago that they had very low fertility and and everybody was saying, "Oh my God, with the Palestinians have this really high birth rate." Do you know what the Israeli birth rate is now? 3.8. Do you know how high?
That's pretty good.
That's
Yeah,
astonishingly high. Now, most of it is centered among the very heavily religious Jews, so you have
yeah,
perhaps another problem with
Belgium.
rise. But I just want to close on the idea that the culture could, how you mentioned how French Canadians can change very quickly.
Yes, of course.
I could totally imagine in a couple of years somehow a huge trend raging through the francophone community of having lots of kids. Like I could just see it be like, oh, it'd be okay. Now it's fun's over with the modernization. We got to get back to just having lots of kids, and it'll become this big new cool thing. I could
Yeah.
totally see that.
Well, I mean,
You know?
there's a lot of troubling. There's like they say sperm count is down, and there's a whole bunch
Yeah.
of data which is actually
Not in
sort of
Nigeria, obviously.
yeah.
Right, or the religious Jews in Israel. Even with low sperm count. I mean, if you just want to have lots of kids, you have lots of kids.
Yeah, I think there might be
You have
some
4 kids.
major obstacles. Yeah, like I'll go around
Yeah.
and all my friends, none of them have kids. It's
Yeah.
just sort of strange.
All right. Well, you've done your duty then, right?
Yeah.
Thanks again, Christian. It's
Pleasure, my
always a
pleasure.
pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for listening to today's guest on the Megablast podcast. I've been your host, Jason Mcdonald. This podcast is brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal, which is also available in the Permanent Archives of Canada. Visit us online at artsandopinion.com.